3 weeks. That was how long Mara had been scrubbing the stone floors of Veldrath Keep before she understood that something was watching her, not the wolves. The wolves had never paid her any attention at all, which was the way things were supposed to be. Omega servants didn't warrant the gaze of pack wolves, not in Veldrath, not in any of the northern keeps where the old laws still held. She was a body that carried buckets, a pair of hands that wrung out rags, a shadow that moved through corridors and forward before the rank wolves rose for their morning meal. That was the compact, unwritten but absolute, that governed her place here. But something had started watching her on the 22nd day. She felt it first as a warmth between her shoulder blades, while she was bent over the kitchen hearth, stirring ash from the grate. Then, as a pressure, like a thumb pressed gently at the nape of her neck, when she crossed the upper corridor carrying linens to the east wing. She told herself it was drafts. The keep was old enough that cold air found channels through the stone, the way water found cracks, moving in ways that felt almost intentional. She told herself a lot of things in those early days that she would later understand were wrong. On the morning of the 23rd day, she was on her knees in the great hall, working the wide mop in long arcs across the flagstones, when the wolves came in from their pre-dawn run. There were 11 of them, broad-shouldered men and women in the loose clothes they pulled on after shifting back, smelling of pine resin and cold mud and the particular iron salt smell of pack sweat. They moved around her the way water moved around a stone in a stream, without acknowledgement, without eye contact, their conversations continuing unbroken. Mara kept her eyes down, her hands moving, the mop head darkening with each pass across the old gray stone. She didn't look up. She never looked up. And then one of the wolves stopped. She heard it first as an absence of footsteps. Then she was aware, without raising her head, of boots standing still in the edge of her peripheral vision. Large boots, worn at the toe, laced with cord that had been repaired twice. She knew those boots. Everyone in Veldrath Keep knew those boots, because you learned quickly to listen for them and to make yourself small when you heard them coming. They belonged to Kale, the alpha. She waited for him to move on. That was what alphas did when they found a servant in their path. They stepped around, or they didn't notice, or in the worst cases they said something cutting about the quality of the work and moved on. She pressed the mop into the corner of a flagstone seam and waited. He didn't move. After what felt like a full minute, she allowed herself the smallest possible upward glance, just enough to confirm that yes, it was him, that yes, those were his boots, that yes, she had not imagined the stillness. She should not have looked. She knew that the moment she did it, a violation of a rule so deeply ingrained it felt biological. He was looking directly at her. Kale of Veldrath was not a beautiful man in the way that the stories sometimes made alphas beautiful. He was hard-looking, in the way that old wood was hard, that stone was hard, things shaped by compression and time rather than by any deliberate artistry. He was somewhere past 40, with a jaw that had been broken at least once and had healed slightly wrong, and eyes that were a pale, washed-out gray that she had heard other servants describe as colorless. She disagreed. They weren't colorless. They were the color of sky before a storm, that particular flat silver that meant the air was about to change. He was looking at her the way you looked at something you couldn't quite place, something that had appeared in a familiar room and didn't belong there, but also somehow couldn't be dismissed. Mara looked back down at her mop. Her heart was doing something unpleasant behind her sternum. He walked away. The sound of his boots on the flagstones resumed, and then receded, and she breathed out through her nose, very slowly, and kept mopping. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. She had come to Veldrath Keep through the same route most Omega servants came to the northern keeps, necessity dressed up as choice. She had no pack, had not had one since she was 12 years old, and the sickness came through the valley settlement where she'd been born and taken. Her mother and her mother's bonded mate, and 3/4 of everyone else besides. Unaffiliated Omegas had two options in the Northern Territories. They could drift, which was dangerous in ways she didn't need to catalog, or they could contract themselves to a keep as household staff, which was stable and safe and suffocating in a way that was almost pleasant if you didn't think about it too hard. Mara was 31 years old, and she had spent the last 11 years not thinking about it too hard. She was good at her work. More than good, if she was honest, which she tried to be, at least internally. She had an eye for grime that other servants missed, a patience for the repetitive labor that kept old stone from falling into decay, and, critically, the ability to be invisible. That last skill was the most valued in a keep like Veldrath. The wolves here were old pack, going back 14 generations, with traditions and hierarchies and sensitivities about territory and status that made the air in the corridors feel sometimes like the air before a lightning strike. A servant who was seen too much was a servant who caused friction. Mara caused no friction. She was very, very good at not being seen, which made what had been happening for the last 3 weeks, and now 4, so deeply unsettling. It wasn't just the Alpha's gaze, though that was the most alarming element. It was the wolves, all of them, one by one, and then in pairs, and then in small groups. They had started to notice her, not in the way you noticed a stone on the path, registering and dismissing. In the way you noticed something you were trying to understand. The first had been a young female wolf named Dessa, barely out of her adolescent years, who had been posted to guard the East Corridor during a minor territorial dispute with a neighboring pack. Dessa had been leaning against the stone wall when Mara came through with the linen cart, and Dessa had straightened up, her nostrils flaring, her head tilting in that specific way that wolves tilted their heads when their animal instincts were parsing something that their human minds hadn't caught up with yet. She hadn't spoken. She'd just watched Mara move down the corridor with an expression that was half confusion and half something Mara couldn't name. After Dessa, there had been old Renwick, a wolf of 60-something who served as the pack historian and who Mara had always assumed was too absorbed in his scrolls and his memories to notice anything as mundane as a servant. She'd been wrong. He had looked up from his work as she dusted the shelves of the archive room, and he had watched her the entire time she was in the room, not moving, not speaking, just watching, with this expression that was unmistakably the expression of a man trying to remember something important. After Renwick, the dam had slowly begun to break. By the end of the 4th week, there was not a wolf in Veldrath Keep who didn't watch her when she entered a room. They weren't hostile. That was the thing that kept the fear from becoming pure panic. If they had been hostile, if there had been that particular amber light in their eyes that meant aggression, she would have understood it. She'd been in enough pack spaces to know what aggression looked like. This wasn't that. This was something she had no word for. Something that felt uncomfortably like recognition. She started sleeping with her back against the wall. The keep had a small room off the larder that had been assigned to her when she arrived, barely large enough for a cot and a chest for her belongings, with a single high window that let in a slit of gray northern sky. She had been grateful for it. Privacy was not a given for Omega servants in the northern keeps. Some slept in communal rooms, some slept in closets. Her little room was hers, and she had come to love it the way you loved things that were small and certain in an uncertain world. She was lying on her cot on the night of the 28th day, listening to the keep settle around her, into its nighttime sounds, when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. She knew those footsteps. She had spent 4 weeks cataloging the footsteps of every wolf in this keep, because that's the kind of thing you did when you were an Omega servant and your survival depended on knowing who was where. These were heavy and deliberate, with a slight drag on the left foot from an old injury. The Alpha's footsteps. They stopped outside her door. She lay perfectly still, her eyes open in the dark, every nerve in her body switched to maximum alertness. The silence stretched. She counted her own heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. She got to 27 before she heard him exhale, a long, slow breath through the nose, and then the footsteps resumed and moved away down the corridor. Mara pressed both hands flat against the rough wool of her blanket and stared at the ceiling, and told herself, with great deliberateness, that she was not going to think about what this meant. She failed, obviously. She started asking questions in the only way available to her, which was indirectly, through the small economies of conversation that servants conducted in kitchens and supply closets, and while passing each other in service corridors. Veldrath's head cook, a large warm woman named Sable, who had been here longer than anyone and who had a gift for knowing things she shouldn't, was her best source. Sable had been an Omega herself once, contracted to two keeps before settling here, and she understood the currency of information and dispensed it carefully but without cruelty. Mara found her opportunity on a morning when they were working alone in the kitchen. Sable kneading bread dough and Mara cleaning out the cold stores, when she asked, as casually as she could manage, whether there was anything unusual in the pack's history, something the servants should know about. Something that affected how they went about their work. Sable had gone very still for a moment. Then she had kept kneading, her wide hands pressing deep into the dough, and she had said, without looking up, that Mara should ask her a more specific question. Mara had thought about that for a moment, and then she had asked why the wolves watched her. The bread dough got a long, vigorous hence before Sable answered. There was a curse, she said. There had always been a curse, for as long as Veldrath had been Veldrath. 12 generations back, a woman of the pack had been wronged so badly that her dying was a pronouncement rather than just a death. She had been a ranked wolf, a strong one, promised a place beside the alpha of her time. And the alpha of her time had looked away from her when her power began to rival his and had let his betas drive her out. She had died in the winter in the snow alone. And before she died she had said something, or the land had said something through her, or the old powers had said something using her voice. And what was said had bound itself to Veldrath's bloodline, the way iron binds to stone. Mara asked what was said. Sable was quiet for long enough that the bread dough had been punched flat and was being rolled back into a ball. Then she said that as best as Renwick the historian had ever been able to reconstruct it, what was said was this: that until the Alpha of Veldrath followed an Omega woman with the full willingness of a wolf following its true north, the pack would be bound in the half-life of what they had done, never quite whole, never quite free. The wolves would know no peace that lasted. Their bonds would fray. Their seasons would blur. Their alpha line would carry a weight in the chest that no amount of territory or strength could lift. Mara had stopped moving in the cold stores. She asked, very carefully, how long the curse had been in effect. Sable had looked at her then, for the first time in the conversation, directly and steadily. 412 years, she said. And then she went back to her bread. Mara had stood in the cold stores for a long time after that, holding a jar of pickled beets she had no memory of picking up, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. She didn't know what to do with this information. She was not a woman given to magical thinking. She had survived too much on too little to afford the luxury of believing in things she couldn't see and touch and verify. But she also had not survived this long by ignoring evidence. And the evidence was undeniable. 11 wolves changing their behavior toward a single Omega servant. An alpha who stopped walking to look at her. The feeling of being watched by something that was trying to remember. 12 generations of historical weight pressing down on a keep that smelled of pine and iron and old stone. She put the pickled beets back on the shelf. She picked up her cleaning cloth. She told herself, with the same deliberateness she applied to everything, that none of this was her business or her problem, and that the best thing she could do was continue to be invisible and let whatever was happening play out without her involvement. She failed at this too. The direct confrontation happened 11 days later. She was in the upper corridor, the long one that ran the spine of the keep's second floor, and smelled perpetually of the beeswax she used on the wall sconces, when she rounded a corner and walked directly into Kale. Not around him, not past him, into him. Her nose hit his collarbone. Her cleaning bucket swung and the soapy water in it sloshed over the edge and onto the floor and onto his boots, and she stumbled back and grabbed the wall because her footing had gone, and she was certain, with cold absolute certainty, that this was the moment everything went badly, that this was the kind of mistake that ended contracts, that this was the kind of accident that an Omega servant did not survive professionally, and sometimes did not survive at all. She pressed herself against the wall and kept her eyes down and said, in the flattest, most controlled voice she could find, that she was sorry, that it was entirely her fault, that she would clean his boots immediately. There was a pause. Then he said quietly, that the boots were fine. She risked a glance. He was looking at the puddle of soapy water spreading slowly across the flagstones, and his expression was something she didn't know how to read. Not anger, not irritation. Something more like a man who has been trying to solve a problem for a very long time and has just found, unexpectedly, that the problem has come to him. He asked her name. She told him. He said it once as if testing its weight in his mouth. Mara, 2 syllables. He said them the way you said words, in a language you were learning, carefully, with attention. Then he asked how long she had been in Veldrath Keep. She said 4 weeks and 2 days. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and she heard something in his voice that she would spend a long time afterward trying to name, that he had been feeling something since before he could see her, since before she arrived. As if the keep had known she was coming, and had shifted its weight toward the door. She did not know how to respond to this. She was a woman who cleaned floors for a living. She did not have a prepared response for an alpha telling her that his ancient stone keep had metaphysically anticipated her arrival. She said, with what she thought was remarkable composure, that that was an unusual thing to feel. He looked at her then, directly, for long enough that the soapy water finished spreading and started seeping into the seam between 2 flagstones. His gray eyes were doing that thing they did, that storm sky thing, and she held the wall and held his gaze because she had been given the deep, irrational conviction that looking away would be worse. He said that she didn't smell like she was afraid of him. She said, because it was true, that she was a little afraid. He said that she smelled like she was a little afraid, and also like she was staying anyway. She had nothing for that. He stepped around the puddle, around her, and continued down the corridor. She stayed against the wall until his footsteps faded, and then she slid down the wall slightly, not to the floor. She was not a woman who slid to the floor. But she let the wall bear more of her weight than usual for a moment. She stood there with the empty bucket in her hand, and the soapy water soaking into the stone around her feet, and she thought, with a clarity that felt almost violent, that she was in significant trouble. She requested a meeting with the keep's majordomo that afternoon, a dry-mannered beta wolf named Quill, who managed all contracts and logistics, and who she had spoken to perhaps 4 times in her tenure here. She went through the formal channels because that was the correct way to do things. And she sat in his small office off the main hall, and she told him, in plain and careful language, that she believed there might be a compatibility issue with her posting here, and that she was requesting a review of her contract and possibly a transfer to another keep. Quill had looked at her over the tops of his ledgers for a long moment. Then, he had said that her contract was in perfect standing and there were no grounds for a voluntary transfer at this time. She said that she felt the current arrangement might be creating tensions in the pack. He said that the pack's tensions were not her concern. She pressed, carefully, saying that she had become aware of some attention from Sinzin's wolves that made her uncomfortable. And that in the interest of maintaining good pack function, she thought a reassignment would be prudent. He had set down his pen at that. He'd looked at her the way Sable had looked at her, that same direct and knowing look. And he had said, very quietly, that he appreciated her discretion and her professionalism, and that he was going to pretend this conversation had not happened, and that she should go back to her work. She went back to her work, but something had shifted in her after the corridor encounter, and she knew it in the way you knew when a door had changed on its hinges, when a thing that had been closed was now barely, fractionally open. She didn't want it open. She had worked very hard to become someone who kept doors closed, who lived in the small and manageable space of a defined life. Because that was the kind of life that did not hurt you in the ways the undefined life had hurt her. Closed doors were safe. She knew what was on this side of them. She knew nothing about what was on the other side of whatever was opening now, and that was the problem. She thought about the dying woman, 12 generations back, alone in the snow. She thought about what it must have cost to turn your last breath into a reckoning. She thought about 412 years, which was long enough for the offense to have become legend, and the legend to have become stone, worked into the walls and the sconces and the seams of the flagstones she mopped every morning. She thought about the weight that Sable said the alphas of this line carried in their chests, And she thought about the way Kale had sounded in that corridor. Not like a man pronouncing something, but like a man confessing. She was an Omega servant. She had no rank, no claim, no standing in any structure that Veldrath Keep recognized. She was a woman with a mop and a small room off the larder and 2 changes of work clothes, and a jar of dried herbs she'd brought from her last posting because she couldn't sleep without the smell of them. She was not a figure in a story. She was not the answer to a 400-year-old wrong. She told herself this with great conviction every morning for the next 6 days. While the wolves of Veldrath Keep watched her, and the Alpha's footsteps stopped outside her door at night, and the pressure between her shoulder blades became something she had stopped. Pretending was a draft. The crisis arrived on an ordinary evening, announced by nothing more dramatic than the smell of rain. She was in the archive room, replacing the candles in the iron brackets that lit old Renwick's work table, when the weather changed outside. She could hear it, the shift in the wind against the narrow windows, the first pattering of rain on the sill. She could smell it, that particular cold earth smell that meant the northern rains, the ones that came before the snows. She had always liked that smell. It was one of the few uncomplicated pleasures available to her. She was on the small stepladder, reaching up to seat a candle properly in its bracket, when Renwick spoke behind her. He said that he had been trying to understand what he was looking at for 39 days. She didn't move. She said carefully that she wasn't sure she knew what he meant. He said that she did, and that she was too honest to pretend otherwise, and he had been a historian long enough to know what was worth documenting and what was worth saying aloud before it was only documented. She came down from the stepladder. She turned around. He was sitting behind his work table, with his hands folded on top of a scroll that she could see, even from across the room, was very old. He was looking at her with that expression that she had catalogued in every wolf in this keep, the one she still didn't have a name for. In him, on his aged scholar's face, it looked most like reverence. That alarmed her more than any of the other versions. She asked him to say what he needed to say plainly. He said that the account he had spent 30 years reconstructing from fragments and oral histories, and the oldest surviving documents in Veldrath's archive, described the resolution of the curse in terms that were, he acknowledged, frustratingly vague, because the woman who had said it had also been vague. Deliberately so, he suspected, as a kind of final exactitude. The wrongness would be righted when it was rightly followed. That was the phrase. The wrongness would be righted when it was rightly followed. 12 generations of alphas and historians and pack elders had argued about those words. When an alpha followed pack law correctly, when a wolf followed their true north, when the pack followed an omega woman of sufficient significance. Different interpretations, different eras, different degrees of desperation. She asked which interpretation he believed. He said that he believed the one that was happening. She was very still. He said that in 39 days he had watched every wolf in this keep, from the youngest guard to the alpha himself, orient toward a single point, in a way he had read about but never expected to witness. Not with aggression, not with the challenge-response of rank dynamics, with something older and simpler, the way a compass needle moved, the way a plant moved toward light, without volition, without understanding, without being able to stop. He said that the last time anything like this was recorded in the archive was 412 years ago. Mara sat down on the stepladder because her legs had made the decision without consulting her, she said, and she heard how thin her voice was, that she was a servant, that she was not ranked, that she had no pack, no blood claim, no standing in any hierarchy that would make her significant enough to figure in a curse of this magnitude. He said that he thought perhaps the curse had never been about rank or blood claim. She said nothing. He said that the woman who had said it had been wronged because her power was recognized too late, and then feared and then erased. He said that maybe what mattered was not what kind of power. Not the ranked wolf kind or the formal hierarchy kind, but the kind that made rooms different when you entered them. The kind that made 11 wolves and 1 alpha stop what they were doing and pay attention. The kind that had survived 11 years of invisibility and was still there, undimmed, underneath the work clothes and the cleaning bucket, and the careful downward gaze. Mara stood up from the stepladder. She set it against the wall with great care. She said steadily that she needed to think. He said that he understood. He said there was no urgency, strictly speaking, except the urgency of 400 years. She almost laughed. Almost. She went back to her room, and she sat on the edge of her cot, with her hands clasped between her knees, and she thought. She thought about what it would mean to be seen. Not as a servant, not as a body that carried buckets, not as a shadow in a corridor. To be seen as the thing Renwick had described. The thing she had been careful, for 11 years, not to be. She thought about the cost of being that thing. She had watched it happen to others, in passing, in the various keeps and settlements she had moved through in her contracted years. Omega women of unusual presence. Women who drew attention, and what that attention cost them, in a world where they had no formal protection. She had learned to prevent it, to dim herself, to be the invisible woman with the mop, because invisible was the armor that worked. She thought about Cale, about his jaw, and his storm-gray eyes and his voice in the corridor, saying she smelled like she was staying anyway, about his footsteps stopping outside her door in the dark. She thought about the woman in the snow. She was not that woman. She was not ranked, not strong in the ways the pack world recognized as strength, not driven by the specific grievance of one who had been promised a place and then denied it. She was an Omega servant with no promises made or broken, no grand claim to make against anyone. She was just a woman who had been mopping floors for 4 weeks and had apparently undone something that 12 generations of more qualified people had been unable to undo, and she had no idea what to do with that. She slept badly. The next morning, she was in the great hall before dawn as usual, beginning the long, systematic mopping that started at the far end and worked toward the main doors. She was in the rhythm of it, the methodical back and forth that she had always found almost meditative. When the door to the Alpha's study opened and Cale came out, he was not dressed for a run. He was dressed for the day, or partly dressed, his shirt untucked and his feet bare on the cold stone, and he looked like a man who had also slept badly. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she saw him. For a moment they were simply 2 people in a dark hall, each caught in the act of being awake too early. Then he crossed the hall and sat on the edge of one of the long benches that lined the wall. And he said, without preamble, that he needed to tell her something. She waited. He said that he had been an Alpha for 17 years, that he had done everything an Alpha was supposed to do, held territory, managed disputes, strengthened the pack line, honored the traditions, that he had done all of it with the specific weight in his chest that his father had described to him and his grandfather had described to his father. And as far back as the stories went, the weight that everyone in the Alpha line had simply accepted as the price of leadership. He had never expected it to lift. He said that for the last 5 weeks it had been getting lighter. His voice was very even. He was a man, she understood, who had trained his voice to be even, the way she had trained hers, because that was what you did when you needed people not to see what was happening inside you. He said he was not asking her for anything. He was not making any claim. He was aware that she was a contracted servant, and he was an Alpha. And the distance between those positions was significant by every formal measure the pack world had. He was aware that what was happening was not anything she had asked for or consented to. He said that he had been standing outside her door at night, not because he intended anything but because his feet brought him there, and he had not yet found a way to argue with his feet about it. Mara looked at him for a long time. Then she said that she had not asked for any of this either. He said he knew. She said that she was not a symbol, that she was not a resolution to someone else's historical wrong, that whatever the curse was or meant or required, she was a person, and she needed him to know that she understood the difference even if the curse didn't. He said quietly that he did know, that he had known it from the first morning, when he stopped in the hall and looked at her and felt something in his chest respond like a compass to north, and that the first thing he had told himself was that she was a person and not a mechanism, and that whatever he felt, she was not obligated to reciprocate. She asked him why he was telling her this now. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because Renwick had told him what she'd asked Sable, and what she'd asked him in the archive room. and he thought she deserved to hear his part of it from him rather than from the accumulated whisper network of the keep. She almost smiled at that. She held it back, but only just. She asked him, because she was a woman who preferred direct questions, whether the weight in his chest was the only reason he came to stand outside her door. He looked at her then, a long look, and in the gray pre-dawn light of the great hall, his eyes were the exact color she had named them in her mind. Storm sky, that particular shade that preceded change. He said no. The air in the great hall settled differently after that. She was aware of her own breathing and of the mop handle in her hands, and of the cold stone through the thin soles of her work shoes, and of the distance between them, roughly 4 feet of pre-dawn dark across old flagstones. She asked him what she was supposed to do with that. He said he didn't know. He said he had 17 years of experience making decisions for a pack, and no experience at all with this. With the particular situation of not knowing what he was owed and not wanting to take anything he wasn't given. She said that was a surprisingly humble thing for an alpha to say. He said he was aware that he didn't have a good track record historically. She understood that he didn't mean himself personally, and the weight of 12 generations and 412 years sat in that statement in a way that she felt in her sternum. She said she needed more time. He said she could have whatever she needed. She went back to mopping. He sat on the bench for a while and watched her work, not in the way the wolves watched her. Not with that confused animal alertness, but in the way of a man who was sitting with something he had been carrying for a very long time and had just, cautiously, set down. After a while he got up and went back into his study, and she finished the haul in the gray morning light, and something that had been tightly coiled in the center of her chest had, very slightly, loosened. The confrontation that changed everything came not from KL, but from the pack. It came in the form of a woman named Bryn. Bryn was the first-ranked female in Veldrath's pack structure, a wolf of 45, who had occupied that position for 9 years, and who carried it with the kind of easy, total authority that made you understand she had never questioned her right to it. She was not unkind as the wolves of Veldrath went. She had not been one of the wolves who watched Mara with that confusing animal attentiveness. She had simply, as far as Mara could tell, not noticed her at all. That changed on a gray afternoon 6 days after the dawn conversation in the great hall. Mara was in the east corridor, rehanging a tapestry that had been taken down for cleaning, when Bryn came through. Bryn stopped. Bryn looked at her, and this was not the compass needle look. This was an assessment. The look of a woman evaluating a threat. Bryn said, without pleasantry, that she wanted to speak plainly. Mara kept her hands on the tapestry and said that was fine. Bryn said that whatever was happening with the pack was something none of them had been prepared for and none of them entirely understood, but that it was undeniably happening, and that Mara was at the center of it. She said that she had spoken to Renwick, that she understood the history, that she was not disputing the history. She said, but Mara waited. Bryn said that Veldrath had a specific kind of order, carefully maintained, that kept the wolves functional and the pack intact. That order depended on everyone occupying the position they occupied, without the positions leaking into each other. An Omega servant, who became something other than an Omega servant, particularly in relation to the Alpha, was a disruption to that order that she could not predict the consequences of. She said that she was not asking Mara to leave. She was asking her to be careful. Mara came down from the small stool she'd been using to reach the upper tapestry hook. She turned to face Bryn. She said, very steadily, that she had been careful. That careful was the primary operating mode she had lived in for 11 years. That she had not asked for any of this attention, had in fact actively tried to redirect it, had requested a transfer, had done everything within her limited formal power to remain invisible and remove herself from this situation. Bryn's expression shifted slightly. Mara said that she understood the concern about order. She said that she shared it, actually, that she had no desire to be a disruption to anyone's carefully maintained structure. She said that the difficulty was that disruption was happening regardless of her preferences, and she was not sure how much more carefully she could behave without simply ceasing to exist. There was a pause. Then Bryn said something Mara had not expected. She said that she believed her. She said that was actually what worried her. Because if it was coming from Mara, if it was coming from the servant side of the equation, and not from ambition or calculation, or the kind of deliberate positioning that Bryn would know how to counter, then it was coming from something that couldn't be managed by any of the normal mechanisms of pack order. She said that she thought Mara was probably afraid. Mara said that she was more than a little afraid, yes. Bryn looked at her for a long time with something in her face that had moved from assessment to something more like recognition. Not the compass needle kind, the human kind, woman to woman, the kind that crossed ranks and hierarchies. She said that she needed to tell Mara something that wasn't in Renwick's official record. Mara waited. Bryn said that the Alpha's line had not been the only one affected by the curse. The whole pack had been affected, which was understood. The fraying bonds and blurring seasons were a pack-wide experience, but the first-ranked female position had carried its own specific weight across all 12 generations, because the woman who had set the curse had not only been wronged by the Alpha, she had been wronged by the ranked females who had known what was happening and had chosen their own positions over her. They had not acted when they could have, and that knowledge had worked itself into the bloodline of the first-ranked female, the way guilt worked itself into stone, slowly, permanently. Bryn said that she had carried it her whole tenure without understanding what it was. A feeling of something undone, something owed. That sometimes, in the nights before a pack gathering, or in the still hours of early morning, she would feel it so strongly that it was almost a voice. She said she was telling Mara this because she thought Mara deserved to know that the weight of this was being carried by more than the Alpha. Mara sat down on the stool she'd been using to reach the tapestry. She sat on it without being graceful about it, just sitting down, because standing suddenly required more than she had available. She said, after a moment, that she didn't know what any of them expected her to do. Bryn said that she didn't think anyone could tell her that. She said that she thought the curse was specific in its outcome and completely silent on its method. She said that what she personally would expect, as the woman who had spent 9 years carrying a weight she'd only just understood, was for Mara to stop trying to manage something that was larger than management. To stop trying to be invisible, in other words. Mara looked at the tapestry, half hung on its hooks, depicting some long ego hunting scene in faded blues and golds. She looked at it for a long time. Then she stood up, got back on the stool, and finished hanging it. Bryn watched her work. When it was straight and properly seated on its hooks, Bryn said it looked good. Mara said thank you. Bryn left. Mara stood in the corridor with the empty stool in her hands, and the tapestry gently settling into its place, and the knowledge that she had made a decision sitting quietly in her chest, beside the thing that had been loosening there since the dawn conversation with KL. She didn't make grand gestures. That was not who she was. Not the shape of her, not how she moved through the world. What she did was smaller and more specific, and in the end, more true. She started looking up, that was all. That was the whole of the visible change. She stopped keeping her eyes down. When she moved through corridors with her cleaning supplies and her linen cart and her buckets, she walked with her head at the level it was supposed to be at, which was upright, looking forward, seeing the space she moved through. When wolves passed her, she let them see her face. When they stopped to watch her, she let herself look back. It sounds like nothing. It was not nothing. 11 years of practiced invisibility had shaped her body, had made the downward gaze as automatic as breathing. Unmaking it was not a simple thing. It was a daily repeated choice made one corridor at a time, one pair of eyes at a time. The pack felt it immediately. She couldn't explain how, except that packs were porous things. Their collective awareness far more sensitive than any individual members. And something about a change in a single person could move through a pack the way a change in wind could move through tall grass. Not immediately visible, but felt everywhere. The quality of the watching changed. The confused animal alertness began slowly to resolve into something else. The compass needle behavior began to settle, as if the needle had found its bearing and no longer needed to seek. One by one, and then in pairs, and then all at once, the wolves of Veldreth began to do something she had no precedent for. They acknowledged her. Not formally, not with any of the rank acknowledgement rituals she'd watched them perform for each other in the common areas. Informally, incidentally, the way you acknowledged a person you passed in a corridor when that person was simply a person and not a category. A nod, a brief meeting of eyes, the particular fractional shift of body language that said see you and you belong here. Dessa, the young guard from the east corridor, stopped her one morning and asked if she needed help carrying the heavy linen cart up the east stairs. Mara said she was fine, but thank you. Dessa nodded and went back to her post, and the interaction was entirely ordinary, and the most extraordinary thing that had happened to Mara in 4 years. Old Renwick, in the archive room, began to include her in his habitual monologue about whatever he was working on, the way you included someone who was genuinely present in a room, rather than someone who was simply occupying it. She found herself understanding more about Veldrath's history than she had ever expected to know. Standing beside his work table with a dusting cloth in her hand, listening to him talk about lineages and contracts, and the old territorial agreements that had shaped the northern keeps for 3 centuries. Even Quill, the dry-mannered majordomo, had begun to greet her by name when they passed in the main hall. This was, she gathered from Sable's reaction when she mentioned it, essentially unprecedented, and Cale did not change in large ways. He was a man who had learned to hold himself very still, and he held himself very still with her too, careful and deliberate and aware of the distance between them, in ways that made the distance feel more like a form of respect than a barrier. But the small things. He made sure that the route she traveled most often in the mornings was cleared of the obstacles that tended to accumulate. The boots left in corridors, the training equipment that sometimes spilled out of the weapons room into the passage beside it. He had firewood added to the stacks outside the kitchen, which meant that Sable's kitchen was warmer, and that Mara, who spent her mornings in and out of the cold stores, was less cold. He never mentioned this. She noticed it anyway. He started appearing in the great hall in the pre-dawn hours, not always, not every morning, but often enough that she began, without deciding to expect him. He would sit on the bench with a cup of tea from the night kitchen, and she would mop, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't. And the talking and the not talking were equally comfortable in a way that she had not expected, and that caught her off guard each time she noticed it. He told her things in those morning hours that she didn't think he told people generally. About the weight, which was still there but less, lighter by some increment. That he said he could feel the way you felt the difference between a healing wound and a raw one. About his father, who had been a good alpha by all objective measures, and a man of great loneliness by any honest account. About the 17 years of decision-making, the ones he was sure of, and the ones that still sat badly in him at 3 in the morning. She told him things too. Not all of them, not immediately, but some. About the Valley settlement, which she had never described to anyone in the years since. About the particular quality of that loss, which was not just grief but erasure, the loss of the social context that told you who you were. About 11 years of being very small on purpose, and what smallness cost, the specific price of it, which was not nothing even though it was the price you chose to pay. He listened the way she imagined a good alpha listened to his pack, with his whole attention, without interruption or the impatient restlessness of someone waiting to respond. He was present. She found that she had not been in the presence of someone who was fully present with her in a very long time, and that she had not known until now how much she had been hungry for it. The climax arrived without announcement, the way the things that matter most always arrive, dressed as an ordinary moment. It was a morning in the 7th week. She was in the great hall. He was on his bench with his tea. They had been talking about the northern borders, the complex territorial agreements that Renwick had been explaining to her, and that had turned out to have relevance to a current dispute Cale was managing. A conversation that had surprised both of them with its usefulness, and that had slipped, gradually, into something less practical. She had been telling him about the smell of rain that she had always loved, the cold earth smell that came before the northern rains, and he had been telling her about the specific quality of the light in the early morning from the high windows of the keep. The way the gray of the stone and the gray of the dawn blurred together so that the whole hall seemed to be made of the same material as the sky. She had put down her mop. She didn't decide to put it down. She put it down and she sat on the bench, not beside him, a few feet away, the way she had been careful to do, maintaining the distance that felt like respect. And she said that she needed to ask him something. He set down his cup. She asked him what he wanted. Not what the curse needed, not what the pack needed, not what 412 years of historical weight was pushing toward, what he wanted. Chaol of Veldrath, the man on the bench with the cup of tea, and the healing weight in his chest, and the jaw that had been broken and healed wrong. What he wanted from this, from her, from whatever this was becoming. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said that he wanted to keep doing this. The mornings, the talking. He said he wanted to learn what she thought about things, which had turned out to be a thing he could not stop wanting. From the moment he'd found out that she thought about things at all, which had happened about 10 days, in when he overheard her telling the night kitchen boy a very precise and startlingly accurate analysis of why the pack's water supply protocol was inefficient. He said he wanted to make her less cold in the mornings, which was a thing he had apparently decided to do, regardless of whether he ever got to tell her about it. He said he wanted to be the alpha that the woman in the snow had believed an alpha could be, not because of the curse, not only because of the curse, but because he had spent 17 years carrying the weight of what his line had done, and understanding it had been wrong, and finding that understanding insufficient, finding that he needed not just to know it was wrong, but to make something right, and that the making right required a different kind of following than the one the old hierarchy described. He said that he wanted, specifically and clearly, to not be the kind of man who let a woman disappear because her power was inconvenient. Mara was very still on her bench, she said, and her voice was even. She was proud of that. She said that she had made herself very small for a very long time, and that she was aware, in a way she was only just beginning to fully articulate, that it had not been safety. It had been a different kind of danger. The danger of becoming less than yourself over years rather than all at once. He said that he knew. He said he had seen it, in the shift between the first weeks when she kept her eyes down and the recent weeks when she hadn't, the difference in her, not like a costume being removed, but like a thing growing back. She said that growing back was uncomfortable. He said he imagined it was. He said he was sorry that this place, this pack, had contributed to the conditions that made growing back necessary. She looked at him. He looked at her. The gray dawn light of the hall was doing the thing he had described, blurring stone and sky into the same substance. She moved down the bench. She closed the careful distance. Not all the way, not into him, but enough that she could have reached out and touched his arm if she wanted to. She was close enough to feel the warmth of him, close enough to smell the specific combination of tea and pine resin, and that warm iron salt that was how he smelled when he was still. When he was not the alpha, but simply a man, sitting in the early morning being honest. She said that she was going to need him to be patient, that she had been invisible for a long time, and visible was still a skill she was practicing, that there would be mornings when she would retreat back into the cleaning, and the careful eyes down, and the performance of being nothing, because 11 years was a long time, and the habits of survival ran deep. She said that she was not asking him to fix that for her. She was telling him about it because she didn't want him to misread her retreating as rejection of this, whatever this was. He said that he was not going anywhere. She said she knew. That was why she was telling him. He reached out and placed his hand, palm up, on the bench between them, not reaching for her, just placing it there, open, available, an offer. She looked at it for a moment. His hands were large and scarred, and she knew from the way he carried himself that they were capable of significant violence when the pack required it. And she also knew from the last 7 weeks that they were capable of being very deliberate and careful, because every action she had watched him take in her vicinity had been deliberate and careful, calibrated to a single purpose, which was to not take more than she was giving. She put her hand over his. The hall changed. She would not have been able to describe it to someone who hadn't been there, but something in the quality of the air shifted. The way air shifted before a lightning strike, but in reverse. The tension releasing rather than building, something that had been held under pressure for a very long time exhaling. She felt it in her sternum and in the back of her throat and in the soles of her feet against the cold flagstone, and she understood with her whole body, not just her mind, what had been building in this keep for 7 weeks and in this land for 400 years. His hand closed over hers, gently, not gripping, holding. Outside the keep, far out, at the edge of the range where the wolves ran, she heard it, howling. It started with one voice, young and clear, which she thought was Dessa, and then it was joined by others, and by all of them, rising together in a sound that was not grief, and not warning, and not any of the functional vocalizations she had learned to parse in her years around pack wolves. It was something older than function. It was the sound of a thing becoming whole. Kale was very still beside her. She could feel him listening. She could feel the moment, several seconds in, when the weight she had been watching him carry for 7 weeks lifted fully finally, and what was underneath it was the simple animal fact of him. A man in the early morning with his hand around hers and the howling of his pack rising through the cold stone walls. His eyes were wet. She didn't point it out. He turned his head and looked at her, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything at all. And it was the most complete silence she had ever been inside. The resolution came the way. Resolutions come to people who have been changed by something, rather than simply concluded. Not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of ordinary days that were quietly, profoundly different from the ordinary days before. Sable noticed first, which surprised no one. She said nothing about it directly, which also surprised no one. She began, instead, to make 2 cups of tea in the early morning, setting them on the edge of the kitchen counter, where they could be collected without comment. Mara collected them both on her way to the hall. It was the most delicate and precise way of saying what needed to be said that she had ever encountered. And she loved Sable fiercely for it. Quill restructured her contract. He called her into his small office and placed a new document on the table without preamble, and said that the terms had been revised to reflect her changed status in the household. She asked what status that was, he said, with the particular dry composure that was his version of warmth. That it was the status of a person whose position in the keep was no longer adequately described by the existing categories, and that the new contract reflected something more accurate. She read it carefully. It gave her a formal standing in the household structure that was not quite a Rundolph's standing and not a servant's standing, and was, she thought, Quill's exact and careful attempt to create a category that fit the truth of the situation. She signed it. Bryn came to her on a morning, not long after, and stood in the east corridor where they had spoken before. And she said, with the same directness she used for everything, that she wanted Mara to know that the weight she had described, the guilt weight in the first-ranked female position, was gone, that she had woken 2 mornings ago, and it was simply not there. She said she wanted Mara to know, because she thought Mara should understand the full extent of what had been returned to this pack. Mara said she was glad. Bryn looked at her for a moment with that woman-to-woman recognition, and then she said, almost wryly, that she was glad too, and then she walked away, upright, easy, the particular ease of someone who has set down a weight they had forgotten they were carrying. Old Renwick presented her, on a Tuesday afternoon, with a copy he had made himself, in his old man's precise handwriting, of the original account of the curse. Not the fragments, not the reconstructed version, but the oldest extant record. The words as close to the original pronouncement as 4 centuries of preservation and scholarship had been able to keep them. He had added at the bottom, in the same careful hand, a single line of his own. He had written, and the wrongness was righted. He had not written when. He had not needed to. She put it in her chest with the dried herbs that helped her sleep. She moved rooms. This was practical, not symbolic, though it was both. The room off the larder was too small for someone whose position in the household had been reclassified, and there were rooms in the east wing that had been unused since a branch of the pack's extended family had moved to the Southern Territories 2 years prior. Kale asked her, not told her, asked her if she would prefer one of those rooms. She went and looked at them and chose the one with the largest window, the one that faced north, that looked out over the range where the wolves ran, and where the sky came down to meet the tree line in that long gray northern horizon she had come to love. She stood at that window on her first morning in the new room and looked out at the range and felt the cold glass against her palm and thought about 12 generations of alphas carrying a weight they couldn't put down, and pack wolves feeling their bonds fray and their seasons blur, and one woman in the snow whose dying had been more specific than anyone had given her credit for. She thought about what the curse had actually required, which was not a grand gesture or a blood claim or a formal hierarchy recognizing something it had always denied. It had required something simpler and harder. A man willing to follow without taking. A woman willing to stop disappearing. That was all. That was the whole of it. She heard the door behind her and knew from the sound of the footsteps, familiar now in the way that only things you had listened for through a wall in the dark became familiar, that it was Cale. He came to stand beside her at the window. He looked out at the same horizon. He asked if the room was all right. She said the room was more than all right. He said he was glad. They stood at the window together, in the early morning silence, two people in a large room, in an old keep, at the edge of the northern's range, and the weight between them was not the old weight, not the curse weight, or the carried grief weight, or the 400-year weight. It was the weight of two people standing close, warm in the cold morning, with the whole long day ahead of them. She turned from the window and he turned from the window, and they looked at each other in the clear northern light, and she felt herself upright, head level, eyes meeting his directly, and she thought, This is what it feels like to not be invisible. Not triumphant, not dramatic, not a grand arrival, just present, just real, just here, in a large room, with a person who had set down his history and learned to follow without taking, and with the howling of a whole pack fading into the bright cold morning outside. She took his hand, he held it, and in the great hall below, 2 cups of tea sat cooling on the kitchen counter where Sable had set them. And outside the range wolves ran in the early light, and in the archive room old Renwick's last entry on Nubsis, the subject sat drying on his work table, and the keep breathed around them all with the particular quality of a thing that had been waiting for a very long time, and had, at last, been allowed to stop.